All right, I'm throwing my hat into the ring and I'm getting involved on the question that I've seen hotly debated all over YouTube and other sectors of the internet on whether or not you should be using ported or manifold vacuum for the vacuum advance on your classic car. And the answer is they are the exact same thing, except for when the carburetor is in the idle position and the throttle blades are close enough that it blocks the signal to the ported vacuum port on your carburetor. They send the same vacuum signal in all circumstances except for the idle position. I'm going to show you on a carburetor how it works. I'm going to show you on my engine that this is exactly the way that it works. The key here is, or the most important thing is, that you do run a vacuum advance because you will save gas, you'll get better fuel economy, your engine will run better at cruise and low throttle position, high vacuum situations. If you're using the vacuum advance, you'll be happy that you have it hooked up. All right, so I got to tell you guys, I'm honestly surprised that this is even such a hot internet debate. I've watched videos and listened to really smart people talk about this topic that don't actually understand how this functions. And like I said, I'm just surprised. So let's start with the Carter carburetor. Carter carburetor has two ports on it. 1, 2. The manifold vacuum port is on the right side if you're looking at the front of the carburetor, and ported vacuum is on the left side. Now the only difference is if you look right here, you could almost draw the line right on here easily. Ported vacuum or manifold vacuum port comes out right here. It always is receiving a manifold vacuum signal, right? And I'll show you with a spritz of WD-40. Comes right through there. See that? That's it. So it's always got manifold vacuum, all right? Now, as far as the ported vacuum side goes, that port is right here. Now you see when I have the throttle blades in the closed or idle position, if it's idling correctly, right? You see the transfer slots, they're nice and square. This is actually even maybe a touch high, but we're blocking that port there. As soon as you crack the throttle, it's exposed to manifold vacuum, same as that one, right? That is the only difference. This one has no signal. Ported has no signal at idle if the idle's set up correctly. Manifold always has a signal. But once you crack the throttle that far, they have the exact same signal. And just to show you, in case you don't believe me, that's where that's going to. Let's see, will this stay in a... Okay, we got it to stay a little bit. Yep, that's it. Here, I'll show you one more time, because I'm sure a lot of people aren't going to like this answer. Let's crack that throttle again. And there we go. That's it. That's the only difference. Now, I'll show you on a Holley, too. It doesn't really matter. This is an older Holley. This is OEM 68 Chrysler 440 Holley. And let me just screw with the linkage here for a second. So manifold vacuum, this port for manifold vacuum is plugged into the choke pull-off. But you'll recognize there's usually a manifold port like this on a lot of Holley carburetors. And all it does is comes out right here, and it's always exposed to manifold vacuum, right? You can see even when the carburetor's mounted, it gets manifold vacuum from both barrels all the time. Now, on this particular Holley, instead of being on the side of the metering block, the ported manifold port is right here. This is what was intended to plug into the vacuum advance on a 68 Chrysler 440. And the port for that, if I could get the throttle blades to close. All right, so we got the throttle blades closed there. And if you start to crack them, it's a little harder to see because it's dirty here. But right there is that ported manifold port now. Transfer slots closed in the idle position. You can see someone's modified this carburetor. They've drilled the butterflies. But as soon as you crack it, there you go. Ported vacuum port right there. Now, interestingly, on this setup, you could actually see it comes in here when the carburetor is mounted. Flange blocks this off, right, and seals this off so that this is a port. But you can see it comes over here, down here, right into that ported vacuum port, right? And we'll just spray a little WD in there so you can see it. Yep, there you go. Same as the other. Yep, beautiful. Now, I'm going to show you running on my big block 440 over here. That is indeed the way that it works in practice. All right, now let's start this bad boy up. Hopefully you can hear me over the motor running. Right now I'm hooked onto the ported vacuum. He's a little cold, but you can see at idle, no vacuum signal. Every time I touch the throttle, it moves. All right, now I'm going to move it to manifold vacuum. Now it's got a pretty big cam in it, so you can see it only pulls about 7 inches of vacuum at idle. I'm going to move it back to the ported side. Crack the throttle just a little. Now see, it's under a little bit of throttle, so the vacuum's dropping. But it's about 7 inches. Now, if I idle it up about 500 RPM, you can see now we're at about 10 inches on ported vacuum side. Manifold vacuum, 10 inches, just a hair more. It's just in where it's reading it from, but essentially same signal. Now let's go a little bit more. Inches. Ported vacuum, 12 inches, 11, 12 inches. It's the same shit, guys. Same vacuum, different hole. So what does it all mean? We still haven't answered the question, what's right for you, ported or manifold vacuum? And the answer lies in the way your distributor is set up, all right? So the reason, I mentioned before, the automakers had actually used manifold vacuum for a long time, and ported vacuum started to come out around the mid 60s and was predominant by the time you get to 66, 7, 8 from pretty much all the auto manufacturers. Now, the reason for the switch has to do with emissions requirements that started to come in some states in the earlier 60s. California was earlier on, but by 68, there was a federal emissions regulation. All cars in all 50 states had to pass a certain emissions standard. Now, one of the ways that you can manipulate a car to reduce hydrocarbons is to retard the ignition timing, which increases the exhaust gas temperature and reduces hydrocarbons, which is one of the main things that they were looking to monitor in the mid 60s when they started the emissions requirements. So the vacuum advance kicking in at idle, I know I showed you on my Plymouth how, the vacuum is off both ports at idle, but this engine only makes 7, 10 inches of vacuum at idle and in those conditions right off idle. A stock 440 or a stock 383 or a stock Buick 430, most engines, anything stock camshaft, non-performance in the 60s made at least 16 inches of vacuum at idle. Now, most of the vacuum advance canisters in the distributors in these cars would give you full advance with anything over 14 or 15 inches of vacuum, right? The idea is, the way it works is, high vacuum situations, so either idle on an engine with a much smaller cam, or when you're cruising down the highway, you want to bring in additional timing to increase fuel economy and give you more part throttle power. The reason for that is more advance under low load situations typically will make more power in an engine. The reason for that is the cylinder is not very full, right? So in order to explain this well, I have to get into total timing concepts here, right? But generally, when the engine is under low load, right? Throttle blades open very little. You're cruising down the highway. The cylinder's not filling that well, right? You're in a low horsepower situation. Volumetric efficiency is really low. Think about it. Motoring on the highway, your engine's only making 40, 50 horsepower if you're just cruising down the highway at 50, 60 miles an hour, flat road, right? So what that means is the molecules aren't that tightly packed. There's not much of a load. The engine wants and will tolerate more timing. So the vacuum advance, typically, those canisters on a stock type motor, above 15 inches of vacuum, they'll bring in an extra 10, 12, 14 degrees of timing. And these engines, especially old V8 engines, love that extra timing in those low load situations. So less throttle opening going on the highway, less fuel consumption, more power. You touch the throttle a little bit, the car's more responsive. It feels better. It's good overall. So bringing this back, right? The auto manufacturers had previously been using manifold vacuum at idle to increase the idle quality. Now they started to change their approach on the way that they were setting up the timing for these engines. And in the earlier 60s, a lot of engines, especially the Chrysler Corporation stuff, the standard timing spec at idle was 10, 12, sometimes even 14, 15 degrees at idle without the vacuum advance plugged in. Once you hit that 68 cutoff, right, you'll start to see all of those timing specs come back into the single digits, and even sometimes as low as 0, 2, 4 degrees. Now, the engines don't really like that, right? In my experience, any stock Ford, Chrysler, or GM product I've ever touched has liked a minimum of 10 degrees at idle. That doesn't mean it won't run with less. It's just a little bit more soggy, doesn't take throttle as well. It's not as snappy. In fact, I've honestly found 15 degrees is really a good number for almost anything, no matter how stock and small the cabinet is. And once you start modifying stuff, they like a lot more timing at idle. This thing likes 26, 28, 30 degrees at idle. The cam in here is 255 at 50 thousandths lift, though. You heard it running. It doesn't pull much vacuum. It's rowdy. So what you can do, right? So a very kind of typical advance curve of an older V8 with the stockish distributor would be to set the idle up at about 10 degrees before top dead center, about 24 degrees of timing in the distributor to give you 34 total once you rev it up, and then you add whatever vacuum advance you have. Now, if you have an engine that you're either lazy or you don't have the parts or you don't know how to recurve the distributor, a really easy way to make it idle better is to move your vacuum source from ported vacuum to manifold vacuum. And this will pull in an additional 8 to 10 degrees at idle usually. It'll make the car idle nicer, smoother, better. But when you crack the throttle, if you crack it hard, you're gonna lose timing. So it won't necessarily make the car that much more responsive off idle, right? If you floor it from a dead stop, your vacuum's gonna go to pretty much zero and you're gonna lose that 8 or 10 degrees of timing. That's why I prefer ported vacuum, because typically I recurve the distributor in anything like this that's modified, and I'll set them up for 20, 24, 28 degrees of timing at idle, right? So I don't want the vacuum advance at idle to be to take away timing when I snap the throttle hard from a dead stop. Now, a lot of times it kind of doesn't matter, because like something like this has a 3800 stall converter in it. It's coming off idle without really moving the car much anyway. But it makes the car more responsive. I prefer the way that it feels. Now, the other issue you'll have with a modified motor, if you try to use manifold vacuum on something like this, the vacuum at idle on this engine, especially once you put it in gear, is pretty unstable. It's moving constantly, 5, 6, 7, 5, 6, 7. It's up and down. You hear the motor go rump, rump, rump. The idle's moving with it, right? So what'll happen is you will have, if the vacuum advanced canister you have on there, and you could buy adjustable ones that are more sensitive, if it's sensitive enough to actually move the timing at 5 to 7 degrees, what you'll have is idle timing that's jumping around erratically, adding and taking out, 4 to 8 degrees of timing. That will exacerbate how rough the motor is idling, right? And actually make it feel worse. So that's another reason that I prefer the ported vacuum at idle, right? In fact, that kind of exacerbation that you would get with the manifold vacuum, changing the vacuum advance and constantly fluctuating the idle timing, is how you tune a ghost cam, part of how you tune a ghost cam into a car with EFI. Basically, you make the idle timing jump around a lot, you make the idle air fuel jump around a lot, and it gives the car a real rough sounding idle. Now with EFI, you can set it up with the parameters that make it sound tough, but the second you crack the throttle, it goes away and doesn't make the car run like crap. With carburetor and a distributor, usually the car will just kind of feel like crap, feel like it wants to stall, and you probably won't really like the finished product. I know I don't. So I hope this helps clear some things up for you. Tell me what you think. If you use the one that you want, but know that they're the same with the exception of the throttle blades and the idle position, and use this to your advantage.